Throughout history, the greatest empires of Europe and Asia endured great struggles against the horsemasters of the Eurasian steppe. This flat and grassy region that stretched from the heart of Europe to the end of Asiatic Russia oftentimes resembled one of the great oceans in its magnitude. The wooden ship was not, however, the master of the green and gold seas of the steppe, but rather the four-legged horse. The Bulgars were descendants of the steppe tribes that had chosen to intertwine their identity with this animal 2,000 years before the Common Era. They had tamed the lead stallions and mares of the local wild horse herds, and instead of treating the rest of the tamed herd as a food source, they chose to ride the beasts. This started a novel relationship between horse and man that allowed steppe tribes to uniquely and fully harness the power of the steppe itself. The previously vast Eurasian steppe looked much smaller on horseback. Horsemanship as a practice started early for both sexes, where before humans could arduously tread 20 miles in a day, they could now swiftly cover 50 miles or more on horseback. Once these people fully mounted their communities, they combined their mastery of the horse with their mastery of the bow to dominate the Eurasian steppe as mounted Darwinian predators. These circumstances produced tribes that were readily capable of great deeds. In the early 600s, one of these steppe tribes, known as the Onager Bulgars under their leader Kubrat, united with the local Utigers and Kutrigers to oust the Avar rulers from their west and Turkic rulers from their east. These tribes established a state that would be recorded by the Romans as Patria Onuguria, today called Old Great Bulgaria. These Bulgars roamed the steppe around the Don and Kuban rivers, and their rulers issued orders from the stone capital city of Phanagoria. The political stability produced from the aforementioned state created taxable trade wealth that enriched the coffers of the Bulgar Khans. This state also enjoyed good relations with the Romans of Constantinople, who not only traded with Old Bulgaria, but relied on its friendly existence as a preventative measure against future invasions of more eastern steppe tribes. It is in the context of this polity and the events of the following decades that both Roman historians and Bulgar oral history preserved a very real and epic tale, one that started with the sons of Kubrat. According to Bulgarian legend, the father and Khan of the five brothers summoned his brood one day. He proceeded to break individual twigs in front of them, one by one and with great ease. Then he wrapped a bundle of twigs and demonstrated the great force needed to break the bundle. Kubrat was attempting to impart a lesson to his sons about the relationship between unity and strength. This was a natural concern for the steppe tribes, whose inherent mobility and fluid social dynamics made larger states prone to breaking apart. Unfortunately, Kubrat's sons did not heed his advice, and a political fragmentation occurred, which was corroborated by two Roman scribes, Patriarch Nikephoros and Theophanes the Confessor. They both tell us of two events that befell the Bulgar state. By 665, Khan Kubrat had died, and the Bulgars, despite their late Khan's advice, had separated. Each brother led a separate band of Bulgars to a different fate. This event deserves its own video, as these five brothers would create five separate political entities of varying success. The second event was increasing incursions and raids by the eastern steppe tribes. The Khazars, like the Bulgars, were horse nomads of the Caspian steppe. They pushed into Old Bulgaria, taking advantage of the political fragmentation. What we do know from the Nominalia of Bulgar Khans is that the oldest brother, Bayan, remained in the heart of Old Bulgaria with the Bulgars who chose not to migrate, which I speculate to be mainly the Logo Utigurs. He may have remained as a rearguard for his brothers, who would need years to migrate with their respective hosts west and north. In the vast steppe, migrations and conflicts were often measured in years, if not decades. Bayan was able to buy his brothers 3 years of unmolested migration from the eastern Khazars. By 668, Bayan finally lost the war to the Khazars and was subject to them as a dependent ruler. The Bulgars who remained in Old Bulgaria became known as the Black Bulgars and integrated into the politics of the area. By now, the youngest of the brothers was deep into a westward migration, leading the lion's share of his father's estate. One of the eastern sources I found mentions he led mainly the Onagar Bulgars, although a sizable amount of Kuchigar Bulgars may have followed him. Another Bulgarian historian speculates that his host would have traveled in 3 separate but closely traveling groups in order to spread the burden of foraging and logistics. He also assigns a number of no more than 50,000 Bulgars at the start of the migration, which I tend to agree with if Asparuch was truly leading the lion's share. Over the course of the migration, this number would drop significantly. After 668, the migrants experienced pressure from the Khazars who had defeated the rearguard of Bayan. Not only did migrating Bulgars perish in the raids and skirmishes, but they perished in the forthcoming perilous river crossings. Casualties further increased anytime diseases occurred or supplies lowered to critically low levels. Typically, these losses would be replenished by the birth of new Bulgars. However, the ongoing migration not only created poor conditions for expecting mothers, but often put the life of both baby and mother at risk due to the added stresses and general lack of supplies. By the time the Bulgars reached the Danube Delta, their numbers had probably dwindled down to anywhere between 30 and 40,000 people, of which approximately 10,000 or slightly more would have been fully grown male warriors who had experience as horse archers. These were now a calloused people who had undergone a great migration. Although we are not given exact dates, it is likely this group had traveled west continuously for close to a decade. They desperately needed a place to call home, even if it was temporarily. This was one of the reasons why the Bulgars looked toward the Danube with hope. On its face, this appeared as reckless leadership by the young Khan Asparuch. However, considering the nuances of local politics, this could be considered an extremely risky but calculated move, and perhaps one of the only right moves. We know the Khazars had established supremacy in the east, which was now a source of danger to Bulgars. Similarly, in the west, although stagnant, the Avars maintained a supremacy in the Pannonian plain that the Bulgars could not challenge. What we also know, and what the young Bulgar leader may have known, is that the Roman Empire of Constantinople, although numbering in the tens of millions, experienced a threat to its capital in the 670s by the Umayyad Caliphate. This had crippled the Romans' ability to respond to any threats near their Danubian border. The Bulgars may have further been influenced by the presence of a complementary people group. As Bulgar scouts explored the Danube, they were introduced to the local Slavs. Although the Romans nominally ruled south of the Danube, the Slavs of Eastern Europe had overrun most of the Balkans during the 6th century. They had established themselves in the mountains and valleys of the peninsula and lived in enmity with Constantinople, which conspired to eventually evict what they perceived as unlawful squatters. The local Slavs were known as the Seven Slavic Tribes, of which the more newly arriving Sevar tribe may also have participated. They occupied the territory north of the Haemus Mountains, but south of the Danube. As a result of their similarity and proximity to the Bulgars, these two people started bonds as trade partners and friends. The Slavs, pressed on both sides by the Avars and Romans, saw the Bulgars as a potential new and capable ally, while the Bulgars, greatly diminished in strength and opportunities, saw the hardy Slavs as potential partners in a new venture. I speculate that the balance of power was so evenly matched between these two groups and their short-term goals so closely aligned in survival that very few of these people saw each other as potential enemies, even if they had very real differences. By now, the Bulgars had at least partially undertaken the crossing of the Danube as a people. They had crossed the Danube's northern tributaries and stopped on a small elevated land called Puce Island by the Romans, but Ongal by the Bulgars. This land was effectively an island surrounded by the vast and wide branches of the Danube. Although non-existing today, during antiquity and the Middle Ages, locals would use this land as a sanctuary from danger. Thankfully for the Bulgars, the Umayyad attack on Constantinople continued until 679, giving them multiple years to cross the Danube and lick any wounds they had endured over the last decade. Although the bonds between Bulgars and Slavs had started forming, the fate of the relationship between these two groups would be determined in the following year. By 680, the Romans had finally repulsed the Umayyad Caliphate from Constantinople and were now free to use all of their resources to squash the emerging Bulgar-Slav state. According to Theophanes, Emperor Constantine raised all the Themata, and he himself led the army north along the Black Sea coast. With the support of the Roman fleet, the medieval legions of Constantinople stomped their way north, with no other aim than the wholesale slaughter of another problematic migrating tribe. After the emperor and his retinue marched the thematic armies. Among these were the Armeniac, Anatolic, and Upsikian themes of the East, as well as the Balkan theme of Thrace. This force would have also included a mounted heavy cavalry component referred to as the Tagmata, although this would have been different than that of the reformed Tagmata of later centuries. I choose to believe the conservative estimate of 25,000 soldiers in the Roman army. Although capable of raising more men, with 25,000 troops, the Bulgar forces were outnumbered by more than 2 to 1, a numerical superiority that the Romans were comfortable with. The Romans performed a routine crossing of the Danube's southern tributary, expecting now to find a meek people ready for slaughter. Instead, once across, they had found the Bulgars had erected many miles of timber-reinforced earthen ramparts along the southern edge of the elevated land on Puce Island. The earth needed for this defense came from the ditch directly in front of it, multiplying its effectiveness as a fortification. Even worse for the Romans, the land before the ditch was wet and marshy, not allowing for a cohesive Roman formation to approach. The Bulgars had made good use of the time they were given to prepare the battlefield. If the Romans could overcome these obstacles, they still had to approach the wall of specialist horse archers, who, despite not being mounted, stood on elevated ground with their well-made bows. Although the Roman army of Constantinople boasted the greatest resources, numbers, and experience of any armed force in Europe, this was largely a group of farming men who came as conscripts, a basic premise of the thematic system. Across the battlefield stared at them steppe nomads that had sharpened their teeth against the harshest trials of the steppe for 13 years. Fighting to the death was the lowest expectation of these people. For 3 days, the Romans and Bulgars stared at each other, the Bulgars too few to harm the Romans, and the obstacles too dangerous for the Romans to attempt. By the 4th day, the Roman emperor had left Ongal. From Theophanes, now the emperor developed an acute case of gout and was constrained to return to Mesembria together with 5 dromones and his retinue so as to have a bath. He left behind the commanders of the army with instructions to continue the siege. Regardless, the Roman soldiers who were previously emboldened by their emperor's presence were now disheartened by his departure on the eve of battle. When the elite mounted units decided to follow their leader, the Roman army lost all cohesion, and now, referring to the infantrymen, Theophanes says, "They too fled, although no one was pursuing them." I imagine the Bulgars probably stared in disbelief for a while, expecting a bigger fight from one of the biggest and oldest empires of their time. Because the Bulgars were struggling for their continued existence, the bloodless withdrawal of the empire could be claimed as a strategic Bulgar victory. But these were a people changed by the trials of the steppe. Even in their reduced and vulnerable state, they knew the only appropriate response to an enemy showing weakness on the battlefield is to attack. Asparuch led his men to their mounts and sallied out of Ongal. Instead of allowing the Roman army to awkwardly scurry from the battlefield like a pack of rodents, the young Khan chose a different fate for the great army of Constantinople. According to both Theophanes and Nikephoros, the Bulgars left their earthen fortress and rode down the Roman army on horseback, causing a great slaughter. Specific numbers aren't given for how many Romans are killed, but because their horsemen were the first to flee, and the Danube was still at their back, I can't imagine there being many survivors. The Bulgars pursued the Romans as far as Odessos. In the following year, the Bulgars pressed their unlikely victory by attacking the eastern Romans in Thrace. The Romans, by now thoroughly defeated in battle, recognized the statehood of the Bulgar Slav Federate State. In 681, Danubian Bulgaria was born. Its members were the Slavic tribes of the Seven Slavs and Sevars, who lived freely and guarded the slopes of northern Haemus. and the Bulgars, who had finally secured a territory perfect for them, the far western edge of the Eurasian steppe. If you like this video and want to see similar videos or support my channel, check out my Patreon. I have some exclusive content with more to follow, and I have created history-based trading cards for any Patreons that are interested.